It happened during the Second World War. In deep autumn, when the first snow had already fallen and it was freezing at night, a group of scouts was thrown into the territory captured by the Germans. It was necessary to find out whether or not there were any civilians left in the village. If not, whether it was possible to blow the enemy to smithereens with a barrage of fire, without worrying about the civilian population. The village was a big one. Before the Civil War it even had its own mill, only a little away, in the woods. Then it was abandoned, and they began to grind flour collectively in the district center. So the road to the mill was overgrown with trees and weeds before the big war. So, the scouts were unlucky. The fascists noticed them and started shooting at the parachutes. One of them got caught in the wind. The wind blew him to the place where the mill stood by the river. The road to it was through the forest, so the Germans could not get through quickly and on motorcycles. They were afraid to wander through the forest at night, so they decided to search in the morning. They realized that the wounded parachutists would not go far. At that time the scouts somehow got out of the slings tangled in the trees, but they didn't know where to go. It was dark, forest, cold, snowing. They couldn't make a fire either. The Germans would notice it right away. So they went to an almost destroyed old mill, which they found by chance. The wounded one couldn't walk, so his comrade dragged him inside. They settled down. At least not in the open air in the cold, but under a roof to spend the night. The mill was tilted sideways and part of its roof was burrowed into the ground, but it still held. The boys crawled inside and, looking around, almost screamed with fear. From the darkness 40 pairs of glowing eyes, or maybe more, were looking at the scouts. Grabbing a flashlight, one of the guys shone it in the direction of the terrible creatures, and froze from surprise. In the corner, huddled in one shaggy carpet, warming themselves against each other, sat ordinary domestic cats. As it turned out, the fascists had burned down almost all the houses in the village, along with the inhabitants. They left themselves a club, and a couple of huts nearby, where they waited for the approach of their units. So the cats, at one moment, were homeless and orphaned. They got away from the scary people, who spoke a language they didn't know, and huddled together in a pack. They found a roof over their heads, and they often got food on their own, not city dwellers after all, not spoiled. There were enough birds in the forest, frogs near the river, and fish in the water, which the cats had adapted to catch. Before there were rats at the mill, but the furry hunters killed them too, and those of the cat fraternity, who were bigger, even managed to catch hares. The soldiers quietly talked to each other, surprised by what they saw, and then a miracle happened. The cats rejoiced like children when they heard a native speech. They came closer, encircled the boys, purring and roaring loudly, and then lay down around, pressed against them, and warmed each other all night. In the morning the Germans came. They, too, had stumbled upon the mill, though they had not known of its existence before. The cats were wary and hissed. The lads hastily burrowed under some debris and old leaves, brought inside over the years by the fall winds. It had snowed during the night, and the Nazis could not find any traces. Luckily there were no dogs with them either. Of course, they were interested to see if there were those they were looking for in the old mill. When the two soldiers, almost on all fours, crawled under the roof that had fallen on its side, they had no time to see anything in the darkness. Shouting loudly, the Nazis jumped out with cats hanging on them in screaming clusters. The animals, hearing the speech they hated, rushed at the murderers of their masters. They clawed at the invaders' faces, wild hatred glowing in their burning eyes. Having thrown the rabid beasts away, the blood-scratched fascists shot at point-blank range all those they had shaken off, declaring to their own that there were no people inside, because no one would survive among these possessed crazy Russian cats. I guess the Germans' attitude towards abandoned mills has something to do with mysticism too. Anyway, they left. And the scout, who was not wounded, snuck into the village at night. Then he came back and told his men by radio that there was no one else there except the Nazis. Later the scouts were picked up by the advancing Soviet troops, and if not for the brave cats, the guys would have died. The wounded fighter recovered and told this story after the war to his son, and the latter, when he grew up, to his son, and I have no right not to believe my father and grandfather, they never deceived me.